Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations will now come to order. The chair recognizes himself for a 5-minute opening statement. Thank you to our witnesses who are before us today to testify on National Public Radio, NPR. I do have to note for the record that we invited NPR CEO Katherine Maher, who declined to appear today, to discuss NPR's alleged past efforts to pressure conservative and moderate voices into silence. Hopefully we can work out a time for her to appear to testify before this committee in the near future. The only reason not to appear in front of this committee at some point in the near future is if the allegations are both true and NPR doesn't care. Last month, longtime NPR business editor Yuri Berliner wrote an article published by conservative news website The Free Press accusing his then employer of having a, quote, absence of viewpoint diversity, end quote. Berliner criticized NPR for not reflecting the viewpoints of all Americans. Instead, Berliner wrote, NPR is, quote, the distilled worldview of a very small segment of the U.S. population, end quote, meaning the people clustered around the coastal cities and college towns. It was alleged that in recent years, NPR's extremely progressive viewpoints are evident in its coverage of major news stories. For example, just a couple of days ago, in an article on a recent bill regarding TikTok and foreign-owned social media, the author claimed that Congress had no, quote, direct evidence, end quote, that TikTok was a threat. That's simply not true. If NPR had listened openly and fairly to comments TikTok's own CEO made before this committee last year, they would know there was no real firewall between the Chinese Communist Party and the American company. They also failed to mention, which would have made it fair, they failed to mention the 3-hour security briefing that this committee had before the committee took up the bill. That type of biased viewpoint affects the way I and many others look at NPR's coverage of ongoing anti-Semitic riots at universities across the country. NPR's coverage of these chaotic protests has been borderline encouraging, nostalgic even, evoking the good old days of protesting the Vietnam War. NPR reporters have dismissed evidence suggesting external groups may have had a role in coordinating these protests, despite contrary reporting by outlets like the Wall Street Journal. As far back as 2005, NPR editors were aware of and trying to address a question that was bothering listeners. How truly national is NPR? For those in rural communities and in smaller towns like the folks I represent, nationally produced NPR news programs are not relevant and not of interest. Nationally produced NPR news programs often simply do not broadcast content that reflects, it doesn't have to be complete, but reflects some of their values and their culture. As a result of adopting a mostly progressive framing in so much of its reporting, NPR is losing audience share. At its peak in 2017, NPR had over 30 million weekly listeners. By 2022, NPR had lost 6.6 million weekly listeners. As a result, NPR has had substantial budget deficits and had to lay off up to 10% of its staff. What was intended to be a media organization that brought together millions of Americans across geographic, socioeconomic, and ideological boundaries to discuss the issues, to discuss life, the arts, and culture, has now turned into what appears to be a progressive propaganda purveyor, using our taxpayer dollars, no less. Now, to be clear, the local public radio station affiliates are not what I'm talking about. I would make the distinction that they have often been more responsive programming and local public interest in civic stories. I've generally thought the local radio stations in my part of Virginia mostly provide a public service and in many cases are useful in helping to preserve local heritage. NPR claims federal spending accounts for less than 1% of its annual operating budget. Although NPR receives only 1% in direct federal grants, local radio stations may use any portion of their federal grant from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting to pay for NPR's membership dues and programming fees. And that figure is roughly 30% of NPR's revenue. This hearing is a chance for us to take stock of whether we should be using federal taxpayer dollars to promote one ideology to the exclusion of others. If NPR wants to create a one-sided ideological content that marginalizes a substantial proportion of Americans, they can fight it out with other media companies for market share and pay for it on their own dime, not the taxpayers. I would prefer NPR to return to its original mission under the Public Broadcasting Act of 1967 to provide objectivity and balance in coverage of controversial subjects. To me, that means representing many different opinions in its news gathering. I want to thank our witnesses again and look forward to hearing your testimony, and I yield back and now recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, Ms. Castor, for her 5-minute opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Public radio plays an invaluable role in communities across America. Our local public radio stations deliver objective reporting on current events, local, national, and international, that is essential to understanding the complex world today. Much of the reporting and features often are not covered by other outlets. National public radio and local public radio stations also are indispensable at a time when many local newspapers have gone defunct, and the consolidation of media into large corporate conglomerates raises questions of their objectivity. Public radio reporting is particularly crucial in my home state of Florida. Florida public radio stations have a long history of providing critical information to residents and visitors during hurricanes and times of crisis. Just this morning, Tampa Bay's WUSF station was advising neighbors how best to prepare for the dangerous storm season ahead. Radio is a top trusted choice for receiving news, weather alerts, community opportunities, and understanding the fabric of America. According to Nielsen, a Nielsen report published in June 2023, radio continues to reach more American consumers than any other platform, linear or digital. And journalists who work for public radio stations are often the only reporters covering local stories important to their communities and are frequently working on a shoestring budget. They are the eyes and ears to monitor local and state government. NPR and its affiliate stations produce high-quality programming for a national audience that these local affiliates can choose to air. Shows like Up First or Morning Edition or All Things Considered, Fresh Air, and Tiny Desk keep millions of Americans informed about national news, provide entertainment, and they keep communities connected. National broadcasts regularly feature reports from affiliate stations across the nation and provide listeners with the on-the-ground perspectives on events of national importance through the eyes of the communities where those events unfold. I cannot help but think of the critical Off the Base series by public radio reporter Bobby O'Brien at WUSF back home. Off the Base told the stories of various active duty, retired military and family members to give the civilian community a better understanding of the challenges of military life during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The public radio reports reached most of Central Florida, with many airing nationally during the wars, when the need for civilian understanding of the dynamics around military deployments and care at home was great. Bobby O'Brien told poignant stories of military families dealing with multiple deployments and how families at home dealt with their life when the service member was in harm's way and after they came home. Despite the clear benefits of public radio, committee Republicans have brought us here to discuss an alleged bias at NPR. Republicans say NPR is biased against conservatives, but what they point to are examples of objective journalism. Disagreeing with reporting does not mean the information is biased. Members may want to, instead, step outside of the right-wing echo chambers, which have routinely peddled lies and conspiracy theories. This Congress will unfortunately go down in history as the least productive in modern times. Shutdown threats, showdowns, wasted time and taxpayer dollars on witch hunts. A better use of time for this esteemed committee would be spent on asking why guns are the leading cause of death among American children, or finding out whether or not America is prepared for the next pandemic as the avian flu spreads among dairy herds, or how we build on the successes of the Inflation Reduction Act to lower health care and drug costs, or how we solve the costly climate crisis. The list goes on. The valuable time of this committee absolutely should not be spent on investigating the backgrounds of reporters. As one of our witnesses stated in his written testimony, threats to defund NPR based on any perceived failure to cover certain topics or imbalance of political representation in the newsroom strikes at the heart of journalistic freedom. Foreign adversaries like the Chinese Communist Party, Russia's Putin, or Iran's violent theocrats certainly enjoy it when American politicians undermine our own objective journalists. This committee should not do their dirty work for them. Instead, we need to invest in public broadcasting, NPR, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Without federal support, many of the stations serving low-income communities in rural areas would be forced to shut down. Congress decided to invest in public radio more than 50 years ago, in part to serve as a lifeline for underserved communities. Even with a moderate increase in our investment in public broadcasting, it would allow public radio stations and NPR to produce the high-quality content millions of us turn to daily. A strong America depends on freedom of the press, and objective public radio stations should be celebrated in all corners of our country. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Now recognize the chairwoman of the full committee, Ms. Rogers, for her 5-minute opening statement.
Good morning, and thank you, Chairman Griffith. Since our founding, Americans have fiercely defended the First Amendment to the Constitution and the freedom of the press. As Thomas Jefferson once said, our liberty depends on the freedom of the press, and that cannot be limited without being lost. Every news outlet and network should be free to express viewpoints, even those I may disagree with. It is a fundamental principle under the First Amendment for news agencies to report on stories however they see fit. It is not, however, a fundamental principle for news organizations to receive public funding to express their viewpoint. We are holding this hearing today to discuss accusations from within National Public Radio, or NPR, that the organization's DC Bureau is actively censoring viewpoints, all while enjoying funding from Americans' hard-earned tax dollars. Following these accusations, Speaker Johnson and I agreed that Congress needed to investigate. I will note for the record, we invited NPR's CEO, Ms. Maher, to participate in today's hearing. She declined to do so, stating that she needed more time to prepare and that she had a conflict with an NPR board meeting. It is especially troubling that an organization funded with taxpayer dollars has mocked, ridiculed, and attacked the very people who fund their organization. As if the problem wasn't self-evident, a 25-year veteran of NPR's national news desk outlined it in an op-ed just a few weeks ago. Uri Berliner, a longtime journalist and senior business editor for NPR since 1999, has described a culture at the organization stating, quote, "An open-minded spirit no longer exists within NPR, and now, predictably, we don't have an audience that reflects America." Berliner also explained how taxpayer NPR never admitted to its audience how off its reporting was on the debunked Russia collusion story, stating, quote, "What's worse is to pretend it never happened, to move on with no mea culpas, no self-reflection, especially when you expect high standards of transparency from public figures and institutions, but don't practice those standards yourself. That's what shatters trust and engenders cynicism about the media," end quote. It was quite revealing from Mr. Berliner that NPR did not want to report stories that could help President Trump's chances of winning the 2020 presidential election, no matter how evidently true or important to the public conversation they were. According to Mr. Berliner, quote, "I listened as one of NPR's best and most fair-minded journalists said it was good we weren't allowing the laptop story because it could help Trump," end quote. Moreover, according to Mr. Berliner, he could not find a single registered Republican editor at NPR headquarters. Since many journalists don't affiliate themselves politically so as to remain objective, this might not sound abnormal, except that Mr. Berliner was able to identify 87 editors in NPR's newsroom who were registered Democrats. Founding NPR board member Bill Siemering put into the original mission statement that NPR should, among other things, speak with many voices and many dialects. According to what we've learned from Mr. Berliner's insight, today's NPR has strayed from their core mission. When an entity that was created by Congress and that receives taxpayer funding strays from their core mission, there needs to be accountability and oversight. The Energy and Commerce Committee will fulfill its responsibility to investigate the allegations against NPR and take appropriate action based upon what we find. That process takes a step forward with today's hearing. I thank our panel of witnesses who will bring to the table a variety of viewpoints about the matter, and I look forward to the conversation. I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. Now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for his 5-minute opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This hearing is a complete waste of this committee's time. We're here today solely because Speaker Johnson sees NPR as an easy punching bag as he attempts to placate the most extreme right wing of his party, and he directed the Republican committee leadership to hold this hearing. It's deeply disappointing that the majority has agreed to play along by attacking NPR and, in a very disturbing turn, demanding that it disclose the political affiliations of its employees and board members. These are the same tactics employed during the dark days of McCarthyism. I had hoped that that was over. This is 2024, not 1953. But again, this is all being done to distract from the Republican leadership's inability to govern and their failure to fulfill any of their promises on their frivolous investigations. I think this committee is better than this hearing. But the hearing was so rushed that the Republican majority demanded that NPR CEO Katherine Maher appear with only a week's notice on the same day as NPR's annual board meeting, which has been scheduled and publicly noticed for at least a year. A further evidence of a lack of seriousness, the majority has refused to accept any alternate date offered by NPR, and it's fully understandable that Ms. Maher is not here today. None of this follows the normal committee process for scheduling a witness in good faith. And even if she could have testified, she's only been the CEO for 6 weeks, yet Republicans would have wanted her to answer for heavily criticized allegations of bias by a former disgruntled employee. And this is particularly absurd given that NPR's CEO plays no role in editorial decisions and does not control NPR's content. These Republican attacks are unfortunate considering that public media plays an important role in all of our communities and should be supported now more than ever. The Corporation for Public Broadcasting is a nonprofit organization that was established by Congress in 1967 as the steward for federal investment in public media. It serves all Americans with free information, education, and enriching content. NPR, a media organization that produces, acquires, and distributes quality news programming, receives investments from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and plays a vital role in democracy by providing important and unbiased information to our communities. These public investments primarily flow directly to local television and radio stations that are often the last line of defense against growing news deserts. And I have one in New Jersey, where communities really lack any local journalism. And there is a reason that Republican efforts to defund public media have failed for nearly 50 years. So that's because the American people value the service. Many Americans, especially those in rural areas, rely on public news outlets as their primary source of local information. Now, only a very small portion, less than 1% of NPR's budget comes directly from taxpayer dollars. In fiscal year 2022, NPR received just over $5.5 million in direct grants from the CPB. And federal dollars that NPR receives indirectly are because local radio stations have chosen to pay NPR for its high-quality programming. If Republicans were truly concerned about journalism and editorial integrity, they would have to recognize that it is actually the vast landscape of right-wing media organizations that have a long history of peddling misinformation, disinformation, promoting partisan agendas, and sowing fear and division. Major conservative networks have paid out vast legal settlements and lost on-air talent who refuse to abandon impartiality and continually lie about our democracy and elections. Why aren't we having a hearing about conservative media and their efforts to stifle alternative views? Just last year, Fox News paid over $787 million to settle a defamation lawsuit after its anchors repeatedly and knowingly lied on air about Dominion's voting machines. Its owner even admitted under oath that those lies were to help Donald Trump overturn the election he lost. Fox News, One America News, Sinclair, and Breitbart are all examples of media organizations that air biased, false, harmful, and damaging content. Public cynicism about the media doesn't come from NPR. It comes from the right-wing media. This hearing is particularly worrisome because we have a Republican candidate for president who spends a good amount of his time peddling unfounded attacks on the media and the freedom of the press. There's so many other things that we could be focused on today that could improve the lives of the American people, and this is not one of them. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back the remainder of his time. That concludes member opening statements. The chair would remind all members that pursuant to committee rules, they have the right to have a written opening statement made a part of the record. But we do ask that, so that we can do this in a timely manner, that any member who wishes to have their opening statement made a part of the record, provide those statements to the clerk promptly. We want to thank our witnesses for being here today and taking the time to testify before our subcommittee. You will have the opportunity to give an opening statement followed by a round of questions from members. Our witnesses today are Howard Husick, Senior Fellow, American Enterprise Institute; Tim Graham, Executive Editor of Newsbusters.org Media Research Center; James Irwin, Federal Affairs Manager for Telecommunications, Americans for Tax Reform; and Craig Aaron, President and co-CEO of Free Press. We appreciate you all being here today, and I do look forward to hearing from all of you. You are aware this subcommittee is holding an oversight hearing, and when we do that, we do have the practice of taking our testimony under oath. Do any of the witnesses have an objection to testifying under oath? Seeing none and no objection, we will proceed. The chair would advise that you are entitled to be advised by counsel pursuant to House rules. Do any of you desire to be advised by counsel today during your testimony? All right, I see that none have requested counsel. Would each of you rise if you can and raise your right hand? Do you promise and affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Seeing that all the witnesses have answered in the affirmative, you are now sworn in and under oath, subject to the penalties set forth in Title 18, Section 1001 of the United States Code. With that, we will now recognize Mr. Husick for 5 minutes to give his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Chair Griffith, Ranking Member Castor, Chair Rogers, and Ranking Member Pallone. I'm Howard Husick, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. I note that I have a background myself in public broadcasting professionally. I was honored to serve on the board of directors of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, nominated by President Obama. I was also a documentary film producer at Boston Public Broadcaster WGBH, where I also served as a reporter and manager for a nightly public television news program. I begin my testimony with a reminder of where public broadcasting began, with the Public Broadcasting Act of 1967. Of a particular relevance to the current situation in NPR is the mandate from Subpart D, Section 396. Public broadcasting, both radio and television, should, it says, and I quote, be responsive to the interests of people both in particular localities and throughout the United States. It is here specifically where I have concerns about NPR. According to the nonpartisan Pew Research Center survey research, 87% of NPR listeners describe themselves as Democrats, 12% as Republicans. In contrast, the major commercial television newscasts are close to 50-50. According to the media tracking firm Sisian, only 1 of 10 of the most popular NPR affiliates is found in the South or Southwest. An NPR slide deck boasts that its programming reaches cultural connoisseurs. As Ray Berliner has put it so well, our news audience doesn't come close to reflecting America. This is not the mark of a national taxpayer-supported program service. I'll discuss both why that's the case, but I'll focus more on ways NPR can be incentivized to serve a broader audience in new and vital ways. These include modest changes in the Public Broadcasting Act, virtually unamended in more than 50 years, even as a revolution in technology has swept over the telecommunications industry. NPR's limited audience is not the result of limited reach. There are more than 1,000 public radio stations across the U.S. Instead, it's come to produce a product which seems not to attract a broad swath of America. That's the result of what the eminent American sociologist Herbert Gans identified in his book, Deciding What's News: Story Selection. Modest changes in the Public Broadcasting Act can foster change in its story roster, as well as help and address a crisis that the committee has already pointed out and that was not anticipated in 1967, the decline of local newspapers, more than 2,000 of which have closed since 2004. Public radio can move to fill this void as well as to fulfill its mandate as per the 1967 Act to help communities, quote, solve civic problems. To do so, we have to let public radio stations across the country keep more of their taxpayer dollars for their own news gathering rather than having to send them to NPR in Washington. NPR receives, as the committee has pointed out, little in direct federal funding, but it relies by its own account for 31% of revenues on fees paid by local stations, some of which are required. In other words, the funds which local stations receive from CPB through their community service grants are recycled and go back to Washington. To make matters worse and more difficult for local stations, listeners can access NPR programming over the top directly through their phones, starving local stations of their financial support. This overall model must be revisited. Public radio news gathering, in order to address the world of today, not that of 50 years ago, must be far more local. Rather than simply getting revenue from local stations, NPR should look to them for journalism. Stories that surprise rather than hector. Stories that will tell us about the range of dramas, conflicts, issues, celebrations in communities across the country. The local stations will provide not the fees, but the news itself. In the process, NPR will nurture diversity views, nurture a new generation of journalists, and incorporate their work into its morning and evening news programming. A decentralized NPR will differ from the major television networks, commercial networks. It will be a forum for all kinds of voices, from poets to preachers, miners, and mayors. It's worth noting that Pew Research just reported yesterday that majorities of both parties say local media in their area are doing their jobs and that views of local news don't have the same stark political divides that exist within Americans' opinions about national news. Finally, NPR should report regularly per amended statute to this Oversight Committee as to progress it's making in reaching a broader cross-section, geographically and demographically, to all Americans. In the process, I believe it will build a new and more successful business model that serves what it's meant to serve, a truly national audience. Thank you very much.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize Mr. Graham for his 5-minute opening statement.
Good morning. Is that on? I represent the Media Research Center, America's preeminent conservative media watchdog organization. It was founded in 1987. I joined up in 1989. We monitor national media outlets on a daily basis and provide daily coverage of the media's tilt at newsbusters.org. Uri Berliner obviously tried to make the point that media bias became a bigger problem when Donald Trump ran for president. We are here to tell you this has been a problem for a very long time. NPR legal reporter Nita Totenberg destroyed the Douglas Ginsburg nomination to the Supreme Court in 1987. Then she tried again with Clarence Thomas in 1991. NPR energetically channeled the accusers of Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh in 2018. And when a man arrived in an Uber on Kavanaugh's street 2 years ago with weapons and plans to assassinate Kavanaugh, NPR failed to file a single feature story on it. Nita Totenberg could not be found. NPR, a supposed source of civility, didn't demonstrate they cared one bit about this potential political violence. But in March, between Morning Edition and Fresh Air, Kavanaugh's accuser, Christine Blasey Ford, was granted an hour of taxpayer-funded airtime to reproduce her unproven charges of teenage sexual assault. Now, most of us, what we remember best, as has been mentioned, the Exhibit A here of NPR's bias is the New York Post series on Hunter Biden's laptop in October of 2020. Most of the so-called mainstream media tried to dismiss this story falsely as Russian disinformation, but NPR stood out. NPR's so-called public editor, Kelly McBride, quoted Terrence Samuel, NPR's managing editor for news. He said, "We don't want to waste our time on stories that are not really stories. And we don't want to waste the listeners' and readers' time on stories that are just pure distractions." He dismissed the New York Post stories as a politically driven event. That's interesting, since you could argue Nina Totenberg's hostile reporting on Supreme Court nominees certainly created some politically driven events. Instead of seeking to investigate the Biden family's influence peddling before the 2020 election, NPR's Morning Edition broadcast a story titled "Experts Say Attack on Hunter Biden's Addiction Deepens Stigma for Millions." There wasn't one word in it about Hunter Biden's business practice involving his father, which was the point of the Post stories. This pattern continues today. When the House Oversight Committee had a hearing in March where Hunter Biden was supposed to appear, NPR's so-called All Things Considered wouldn't consider a feature story on it. NPR covered the Pelosi-picked panel, the House January 6th committee, live for every single minute, and then it couldn't do a 2-minute story on the Biden impeachment inquiry. Instead, NPR's homepage was topped the next morning by their hot story, "New Details on Rupert Murdoch's British Phone Hacking Scandal of 2011. NPR's website did have a Biden mention. White House reporter Deepa Shivaram had a TikTok-like video shoot on how President Biden grabbed a trendy boba tea in Las Vegas under the headline, "Food Stops Can Tell You a Lot About a Campaign." NPR, that network of civility, also has encouraged chaos and disorder in our society. In 2020, NPR's blog Code Switch, with the slogan "Race in Your Face," promoted a new book titled "In Defense of Looting" on the NPR Politics podcast in 2021. They promoted a book by Yale law professor Elizabeth Hinton saying that protests against police shouldn't be called riots, they should be called rebellions. On Fresh Air on April 15, 2023, the movie critic John Powers praised the movie How to Blow Up a Pipeline, hailing it as hugely timely. So this is what NPR is doing. They can devote our taxpayer dollars to getting behind looting, rioting, and blowing up pipelines. And yet, NPR represents the Republicans as uniquely extreme. We've seen this throughout this Congress, where they come on and say, "Oh, the hard-right Republicans are ruining everything." They were doing this morning, discussing Ms. Taylor Greene, but they have had several sappy interviews with Hakeem Jeffries. Steve Inskeep at one said, "You'd say to Republicans, drive the car off the cliff. We are not going to grab the wheel." This is the way they treat Republicans, basically as nutballs who are going to drive a car off the cliff. You might understand that's why we might get a little upset. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back now. Recognize Mr. Irwin for his 5-minute opening statement.
Chairman Griffith, Ranking Member Castor, Vice Chair Lesko, Chair McMorris-Rogers, and Ranking Member Pallone, members of the committee. It is an honor to testify before you today, especially as a former staffer from the other place. It's a shame Ms. Maher couldn't join us today. Normally, a CEO refusing to meet with her funders would have her funding pulled, but we'll see. ATR is Americans for Tax Reform. The organization I represent is one of the leading taxpayer watchdogs of uses of taxpayer money, and we have taken an interest in how public broadcasting has been subsidized by the taxpayer directly. Others have spoken already about the political issues of national public radio, the ideological capture, the fact it no longer represents the American people, if it ever did. But my testimony will take a step back and focus on another problem with continuing to fund NPR. Namely, if all the issues mentioned here today are solved, if NPR was the most neutral, fair media outlet with no ulterior motives, it is still not the role of the federal government to run a radio station. It will not do simply to clean up NPR's current practices because state-funded media in principle undermines a free press. It is unfair to NPR's competitors who do not get federal subsidies, and because NPR is dishonest with the public, as has been mentioned, in its accounting practices. And I say this as someone with very fond childhood memories of NPR. I wouldn't trade the Saturdays I spent listening to Car Talk with my dad while driving to the dump for anything. But when I grew up and began to pay taxes, against my will, to this radio station I hardly listened to anymore, I began to wonder why this was necessary, especially as it replaced the Boston-accented guffaws of auto mechanics with the self-serious whispers of hysterical Marxists that think bird names are racist. A look at NPR's funding makes one even more skeptical. State-funded media, in general, has no place in a free society. NPR is incapable of objective news coverage precisely because they receive taxpayer funds. No media outlet is immune from influence from their paymasters. But even if we assume that NPR is perfectly free from undue influence by Congress, the federal government, people who cut their checks, how do you suppose they would cover a member of Congress who advocates cutting their funding because he or she does not see running a radio as the proper role of government, or simply can't find the money in that year's budget? On public broadcasting funding and other issues, can such an elected official ever expect fair treatment from NPR in the future? State-funded media is ultimately corrosive to our socio-political fabric and ought to be anathema to a free society. It is, in short, a threat to democracy. Federal funding also gives NPR an unfair advantage over its competitors. According to our calculations, which are included with this testimony, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting receives more than $28 billion adjusted for inflation, or has received since 1969, and is asking for a further $525 million this fiscal year. About $128 billion of this will go to public radio affiliates. Except for the occasional fiscal discipline of the 80s or years when the appropriations were frozen, NPR's funding has only grown over time, despite a decrease in demand from the public, with new funding added to the baseline each year. Even if they do a bad job, they still get the money, because that's their baseline now, and Congress approves this unencumbered by the thought process. NPR likes to remind us that only 1% of its funding comes from taxpayers, and at first glance that does appear to be true. 51% of its funding comes from corporate sponsorships, this is what normal people call ads, and private donations, while 31% comes from licensing fees, as the chairman noted, meaning the majority of its money does come from voluntary contributions and payments, just like every other media outlet. If this is true, why do they need taxpayer funding at all? Well, the reason is that the claim that only 1% comes from federal taxpayers is not true. On the same webpage where NPR claims that this minimal taxpayer investment, they also say that federal funding is essential to their mission. Well, which is it? Well, the answer lies in the 31%, as again the chairman has noted. These come from licensing fees that the affiliates pay back to NPR. NPR, according to the latest audit from 2022, received $93 million in revenues from these stations, which would account for 73% of this year's requested CPP grants to affiliates, of the $128 million. So it turns out a shell game is afoot. Tax dollars are given to CPP, which passes a few million to NPR so they can claim the taxpayer contribution is negligible, while the rest is laundered through public affiliates and kicked back in the subsidies to NPR. This public radio financing system is so opaque that no one is actually certain how much federal funding NPR receives. Affiliates are required to keep track of how much money their federal grants come from tax dollars, but a 2011 GAO audit of 23 public radio stations found that the majority do not maintain such records. Saul Goodman could not design a better laundering operation. So in closing, I have a couple of suggestions as to how to remedy this, short of fully cutting off funding for NPR, which would be ideal. The most important one is that if taxpayers must fund NPR for it to survive, and I'm skeptical that that is the case, I think they could compete with other media outlets and do quite well because they have a very loyal audience of affluent progressives who have disposable income to donate to them. Congress could include on tax returns a box that you can check to make a voluntary contribution to an NPR fund in the exact same way we do for the US Presidential Elections Fund. This way, they're gonna get free advertising, a free funding appeal to the millions, hundreds of millions of Americans who pay taxes, but they will not be strong-arming the middle and working classes into subsidizing content that appeals only to the affluent and well-educated. And the other suggestion I have is to answer the common refrain, which was echoed by former CEO Paul Haga, who was a Republican, in his weekend op-ed in the Washington Post, that 70% of the funding goes to affiliates and only 30% is spent on CPB operations and the national public television and radio. Simply give them a 30% funding cut and require that 100% of the money goes to the affiliates in a decentralized manner, as the first witness suggested. I look forward to your questions.
Gentleman yields back. We appreciate that. Mr. Aaron, your 5-minute opening statement.
Thank you. Thank you and good morning. I'd like to thank Chairman Griffith, Ranking Member Castor, Chairwoman McMorris-Rogers, and Ranking Member Pallone for inviting me to testify. I'm Craig Aaron, and I'm the President and CEO of Free Press and Free Press Action. I do not represent NPR, PBS, or the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. I hope today to provide a voice for NPR's tens of millions of weekly listeners who rely on the service for fact-check journalism, local viewpoints, and international coverage. Given the impetus for this hearing, I must clarify that Free Press is a nonprofit group started in 2003 to work on media policy and should not be confused with The Free Press, a Substack publication that recently published a critical article about NPR. Over the past 20 years, I've been both an advocate for and a critic of the public broadcasting system, which I believe can do more to live up to its mandate and its mission. But this will not be accomplished by tarnishing the reputation of NPR's journalists, tearing down the institution, or starving it of funds. Inquiries like today's will likely make NPR leadership more timid, and I imagine that's the point. But threats of defunding don't just harm NPR executives. They endanger the work of more than 1,000 local radio stations, providing essential information to communities large and small. While I always welcome Congress's interest in public media, especially given the crisis in local journalism, I'm perplexed that an essay by one disgruntled editor at NPR is cause for a congressional inquiry. That essay by Yuri Berliner is riddled with fuzzy math and cherry-picked evidence. For example, he inaccurately describes several stories as going uncovered when NPR did extensive reporting or publicly interrogated its own editorial choices. That said, public media's purpose should be to tell stories not already told by the commercial media and serve audiences not represented elsewhere. Berliner laments that NPR's increased focus on racial diversity since 2020, but if in 2024 we're still questioning whether systemic racism exists, we probably need to spend more time listening to the experiences of our colleagues from different backgrounds. Berliner's supposed bombshell that DC residents in NPR's newsrooms are all registered Democrats in a city where just 5% of voters are registered Republicans doesn't withstand scrutiny either. As NPR journalist Steve Inskeep points out, NPR has 662 people in its newsrooms, including far more in DC than the 87 Berliner tallied. His numbers don't add up. Yet these rickety claims have sent this subcommittee down a precarious path. I'm very concerned about the request sent to Katherine Maher, NPR CEO, asking her to track and report to Congress on the political affiliations of NPR's newsroom employees. This is a dangerous overreach that raises serious First Amendment concerns and smacks of a political loyalty test. While Congress has a role in overseeing the operations and financial management of NPR, threats to defund it based on the perceived failure to cover certain topics or hire certain people strike at the heart of journalistic freedom. There must be a firewall between NPR executives and the newsroom. NPR's new CEO may have once volunteered for a Biden campaign. The head of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting used to co-chair the Republican National Committee. Neither is, nor should be, involved in editorial decisions. Berliner insists he does not want NPR defunded, but his complaints have been seized upon by those who would seek to defang or destroy public media. This is just the latest chapter in a long history of attacking NPR personnel on trumped-up charges of bias. Today, we have an opportunity instead to talk about how to rebuild and expand the public media system to meet the real needs of local communities, and we can find common ground. Mr. Husick and I, for instance, agree that NPR should not be defunded, but we should be spending more resources in support of local journalism to replant news deserts. Common ground can exist in Congress, too. I imagine many members here remember a time when there were multiple local outlets covering your campaigns and accomplishments and actually telling people back home what you do in Washington. A renewed and vibrant public media system focused on local voices is possible, but it requires a different approach, one that builds on public media's founding purpose, to quote President Johnson, to use the public airwaves, which belong to all the people, for the enlightenment of all the people. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate your testimony, and we'll now move into questions and a question and answer portion of the hearing. I will begin the questioning and recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Aaron, I just want to clarify one point, and you didn't say anything wrong, but I want to make sure people back home know. When we asked for the political affiliation, it was based on the person's public registration by party, and not by for NPR to calculate that. So we're not interested in if reporter John Doe is a Democrat, Republican, or an independent. Sometimes that's difficult because in many states, like my home state of Virginia, there is no party registration. And I'm not asking, and when we sent that letter, we weren't asking them to go around and do some kind of litmus test on whether they were a Republican, a Democrat, or an independent, but just tell us what the registered numbers are based on, and I know you've have disagreements with it, but based on Berliner's statements that it's heavily skewed towards one party. And while the population of D.C. might be disproportionately Democrat, clearly the surrounding areas, while more Democrat than my home area, should be taken into account. And the national NPR, wouldn't you agree, should be more reflective of all viewpoints and not just one. I'm not trying to stifle if somebody wants to be a progressive, but I do think if the taxpayers are paying for it, that we ought to be reflective of all voices. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Well, thank you for the question, Congressman. I do appreciate the clarity on your intent.
Yeah.
However, I worry about the impact of NPR leadership needing to go in and look at what are the political affiliations and registrations of all of their employees. That's not something that they would traditionally do in hiring. In fact, I believe in the District of Columbia, discrimination, of course, based on political affiliation is a protected class. So I don't think that NPR should be in the business of doing that. I don't think Congress should be in the
And
business of
be
doing
happy to talk with them about it. The concern was that it does appear that they lean way to the left, and that if all accents and all voices are to be heard, I don't hear a whole lot on the national news of folks with accents like mine or people in my district. Mr. Husick, I appreciate your comments very much. I thought that you had some good points, and one of them was that we should do a regular oversight of what NPR is doing. And I learned this morning, I've only chaired for the last 2 years, but I've been on this committee for about 14. We have not held a hearing to discuss NPR on any subject since 1999. So you would encourage us to have more regular things so the pressure doesn't build up to the point that we're at right now. Would you agree with that, or is that what you're trying to say?
That's definitely what I'm trying to say, and I'm focusing on specific metrics that would encourage NPR to serve a broader audience. I'm not proposing defunding NPR. I find a lot of common ground with Mr. Aaron on this, right? What I'm saying, if NPR reports to you, and I'd put public broadcasting service in that same category, the PBS NewsHour.
And make sure you lean into the mic so it catches so the folks back home can hear you. I can hear you, but you lean in. Yeah.
I would put NPR and the PBS NewsHour in the same category. Report on the demographics and geography of your audience to demonstrate and have an incentive to serve a broader audience. When Pew is the most neutral and respected, when it says 87% left liberal, that's disappointing. I don't think that reflects necessarily the views of Republican or Democrat reporters. They should be above the partisanship in their editorial duties. But if on the whole, the service is reaching only a select portion of the American public, that's a problem. And if they report to you regularly on progress they're making in expanding their geographic and demographic reach, I think that would be incentivizing for them to improve.
And you think that would be a better test than the one we asked for about political affiliation then? Because we're just trying to get a fair impression of what's going on. The demographic listenership would help with that, is what you're saying.
That's exactly what I'm
All
saying.
right. And the other thing you said was that some of those fees that are going back to NPR are required for the local NPR stations?
That's my understanding from my time at CPB, which is you pay dues to be part of the public 267-member NPR. There's 1,000 public radio stations,
Right.
and 267 are NPR members. And to be an NPR member, you are required to pay dues in addition to purchasing.
And I'm running out of time, but I will say that historically, even when I was in the state legislature, I supported the local radio stations because they do some programming that you can't get elsewhere, like the history of bluegrass, which is important in my district. I yield back. Now,
I'll just say the Stanley brothers are from Southwest Virginia. Can't beat them.
you can't beat them, although we've got the third generation coming along doing pretty good, but the original generation has all passed away. but they were still around when I was first elected. All right, I yield and I now recognize Ms. Castor for her 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Aaron, I want to focus in on what is happening in the media landscape across America. You know, it was just a few years ago, in my community in the Tampa Bay area, we had two very strong newspapers, the Tampa Tribune and the St. Petersburg Times, now the Tampa Bay Times. Just a few years later, the Tribune is gone. The Times only prints 2 days a week. It won numerous Pulitzer Prizes, as did the Tribune, but it's kind of a shadow of its former self. And I worry desperately about the ability of people to be informed about what's happening in their community. What has happened with the demise of newspapers, and why has that happened in America?
Thank you so much. I appreciate the question. I do agree with you, and I think you have reason to be concerned. As Mr. Husick mentioned in his testimony, we've lost some 2,000 newspapers. And, you know, over the last decades, tens of thousands of working reporters who were the ones out there on the beat, going to the school board meetings, going to the city council meetings, telling people what was happening. And of course, that benefits the readers of these publications, but it also benefits the whole community. Once the news is out there, it's a public good. People can say, hey, did you hear what the mayor did? Did you hear about this corruption scandal? And we've seen that when we lose those local outlets, we lose awareness of what's happening close to home and what's happening here in Washington as well. There used to be a lot of reporters paying attention to what the local delegation did, what was going to be brought home. When that disappears, corruption increases. When that disappears, it's harder to bring money home to districts. People don't even know what's happening. So I think there are concerns across the country about this decimation and decline of local news. And from a public policy perspective, we have to ask ourselves, what's going to fill in the gaps? The market isn't providing that local news, and we have to look for what are the non-commercial additions or alternatives that could support that. I think public media could and should and does in many communities play that role, but it could play a bigger role in supporting that kind of local coverage that really describes what's happening in local committees and make sure those reporters are there. That's why I worry about these threats for defunding, because in many places, these public radio stations, they are the newsroom. They are the 6 or 7 reporters trying to cover a whole locality. You lose that, and then nobody has any idea what's going on.
And a lot of the advertising revenue that supported local newspapers is now gone where?
Well, it's certainly gone to big tech in a lot of ways.
Big tech platforms, right?
And, you know, of course, when the local news is decimated, when it disappears, there's less reason for people to come and be part of it. And of course, the ad market has changed. The internet exists. We're in a new reality where if you want to reach an audience, the local newspaper is no longer the best way to do it because people have other ways to buy their cars.
Does the average person have insight on the algorithms controlled by big tech platforms?
No, the average person doesn't, and almost nobody does, right? We don't have transparency that I think we should have. It's probably a different topic, but the transparency we need to know, how are these decisions being made for us? What do we need to know? As a news consumer, you don't know why you're being fed the headlines you're being fed, if you're even being given headlines anymore, which is part of the problem, which is why something like public radio is so important, because that's obviously a different way for people to find news.
And we've dealt in this committee with foreign adversaries controlling certain big tech algorithms and have tried to deal with that. And it would just seem that we need to put keep the power with the people, especially in our local communities. So are you saying that you think we should be investing more in public broadcasting through the Corporation for Public Broadcasting under the Public Broadcasting Act?
I would advocate for an increase in public media funding if it's going to local journalism and local news. I think that we vastly underfund the public media system compared to the rest of the world. It's about $3.16 per capita per year. In countries like England or Germany, you know, it's $80, $140 per year. I'm not saying it needs to be at that level, but I'm saying a significant increase would go a long way toward helping us have more local journalism, and that should be the priority going forward. I think that would be a good investment that would pay dividends across the country.
And Mr. Husak, you've suggested something similar, is that right?
I am. I think that the fund should, but to do that, increasing will not by itself serve that purpose. The funds, I think there has to be a rethinking of the original authorizing legislation in the light of these vast changes that we've seen, so that we can be more certain that the money will stay at the local level.
I've run out of time, and I noticed that NPR has actually had that debate going on itself. And Mr. Chairman, I'd like to offer for the record the April 16th, 2024 commentary by Steve Inskeep, how my NPR colleague failed at viewpoint diversity, and he gives a perfect example of the kind of journalism he says he's against, and highlights some of these issues.
Without objection, so ordered. The chair now recognizes the chair of the full committee, the gentlelady from Washington, Mrs. Rogers, for 5 minutes for her questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to note that it was previously alleged that only reactionary Republicans are complaining about the bias at NPR. But with unanimous consent, I'd like to enter into the record Mr. Berliner's article. With unanimous consent, please.
Without objection.
I'm going to quote the article's opening paragraph, where Mr. Berliner describes his political views and background. Quote, "You know the stereotype of the NPR listener, an EV driving, wordy playing, tote bag carrying coastal elite. It doesn't precisely describe me, but it's not far off. I'm Sarah Lawrence educated, was raised by a lesbian peace activist mother. I drive a Subaru, and Spotify says my listening habits are most similar to people in Berkeley. I fit the NPR mold. I'll copy to that." That was the end quote. I don't know about anyone else here, but Mr. Berliner doesn't sound like a MAGA Republican to me. He sounds like someone who's trying to sound the alarm about the institution he cares about. It's not the role of Congress to tell NPR or any news organization how or what content it should broadcast or print. My concern here is why American tax dollars need to subsidize a news organization that so clearly does not want to reflect the diverse views of all Americans. Mr. Graham, I'll start with you. As you're aware, Mr. Berliner wrote this op-ed, and in it, quote, he says, by 2023, the picture was completely different. Only 11% described themselves as very or somewhat conservative. 21% is middle of the road, and 67% of listeners said they were very or somewhat liberal. We weren't just losing conservatives, we were also losing moderates and traditional liberals, end of quote. Mr. Graham, I wanted you to speak some more. Build on your testimony about how NPR has changed over the years, and if you believe that it caters only to a select audience, and just what examples you might give from the past 5 years where you believe NPR has unfairly covered Republicans.
Thank you. The idea that Uri Berliner said I counted 87 Democrats and 0 Republicans, to me, the 87 isn't what matters. It's the 0. Why isn't there 1? Why isn't there 2? You know, Pat Corton used to work at WTOP here in DC, and the question was always, he was the one Republican in the newsroom. And what that meant was that sometimes when people were doing stories, they would actually ask the Republican in the newsroom, let me check on this so I don't go off the rails. There's nobody inside the NPR newsroom, as far as we can tell, maybe it was Uri Berliner, who would stop NPR from going off the rails. You know, but what happens is, for example, White House reporter Tamara Keith at NPR goes on the PBS NewsHour. She says what's happening in the House is a reflection of a broader divide in the Republican Party, where there's maybe like 20% or 30% of Republicans who don't want to burn it all down. Does the Republicans here in the Congress think they want to burn it all down? That's part of the point. You know, you can say, well, I don't want to regulate the content, that's not my role. But on some level, this is an undemocratic public radio system that shuts out the viewpoints of people that aren't the regular audience. I am the regular audience. I listen to National Public Radio in my car. You know, I get upset listening to it. Then I go in and I write about it. I may be the weird guy that actually listens to NPR. But when you listen to it, it's very hard to describe it as objective. And I'm offended by the idea that by objecting to it, somehow I'm comparable to Putin. In a democracy, we should be able to say that the media doesn't serve us, that the media is basically kicking us in the keister. So, I mean, I think there should be a role in a public radio system to represent all the public. You can sit here and talk about how it does. I'll tell you it does not. It's not serving me. It's harming me. It's smearing me. And a lot of Republicans and conservatives feel that way.
Thank you. I have more questions, and we have written a letter to the CEO of NPR, and we're going to look for those answers. I wanted to, and I'll do some follow-up questions to other panelists. I really do want to explore this question because I believe it's misleading to say that only 1% of NPR's budget comes from federal dollars, and part of our goal here is to really get a better understanding of the funding. So I'll follow up with those questions. Thanks again. I yield back.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair yields back. Now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to be clear that in the letter that the Republican leadership of this committee sent to NPR, they specifically said in question number 1, in the past 5 years, how many registered Republicans, Democrats, Independents, and registered voters who are not required by state law to declare an affiliation has NPR employed as part of its news media staff? And then they go into, what percentage of the board of directors were Republicans, et cetera. So, it's clear that they're asking for the political affiliation of their employees. So let me start by Mr. Aaron. What is your reaction to this Republican majority's asking a news organization to report the political affiliation of its employees?
As I said in my testimony, Mr. Chairman, I think it's a dangerous overreach. I don't think it's the government's role to tally or investigate or ask NPR leadership to keep track of the political affiliations of its reporters and editors and other employees. I think that they should be judged. The Congress has a role, of course, oversight, financial management, how is the system working? But I don't believe it's their job to do that, and I think it does impinge on journalistic freedom, that what should be judged is the work of the journalists. And as a journalist, what you're supposed to do, or at least what I learned when I went to journalism school, is you are supposed to seek out views you disagree with. You're supposed to look at multiple sources. Now, people may have complaints at one time or another about how an individual NPR reporter did that job. I think on a whole, there is that lot of good evidence of very strong journalism. Some of the other panelists here obviously might disagree, but it's not the government's role, and I actually think it is a major overreach to suggest that based on the viewpoints that you express or cover or the editorial choices, that could somehow be connected and dependent on the funding that you're offering. I think that is a path that I would discourage this committee and this Congress from going down.
Well, I'm going to go further than you and say it's not just an overreach. I think a political litmus test violates the most foundational principles of our nation. And I just think Congress has no business interrogating media outlets about the political affiliation of their employees. And I use the term McCarthy. I really do think it has troubling echoes of a very dark period of congressional oversight under Joe McCarthy, frankly. But let me ask you the second question, and you kind of got into it. Because it seems Republicans, may not understand this, does a journalist's political affiliation impact their ability to produce fair quality work, in your opinion?
Mr. Chairman, it should not. Obviously, every individual, every human brings their own biases to their job and their approach. But the job of a journalist, of course, is to go out and hear what other people think, to talk to sources, to evaluate the evidence. That's what we want our journalists to be doing. And then, that's put out into the marketplace of ideas, and we can get all the different perspectives. So that's why that shouldn't be the starting point any more than I think this committee should go ask Fox News or Sinclair or Nexstar to tell us the political affiliation of the journalists working in those newsrooms. We should look at the journalism they produce, the questions they ask, the stories they choose as viewers. If we don't like it, there are plenty of avenues to register that complaint. There are public editors, there are letters, there are comments. There are, of course, other media outlets covering many of these stories. But what's not appropriate is for Congress to say, when we don't like what this radio station is doing, and now we're going to come in and cut the funding. That's crossing a line.
Don't you, I also worry what happens in a democratic society when a political body like Congress tries to intimidate journalists because of their political beliefs. If you ask whether or not you have so many Democrats or Republicans and what your affiliation, that goes back to the McCarthyism. I mean, what happens when Congress or a political body tries to intimidate journalists or says, what your political beliefs are? Do you see that as
I do see it as a problem. Of course, I wish the journalists, the NPR leadership would push back and fight back here, but what happens and what's happened over a long period of time is these kind of inquiries, these kind of pressure, the working of the refs, it makes journalists more timid, more cautious, more unwilling to ask hard questions. That's what I worry about, that it makes them harder for them to do their job. And what we've seen, what also happens when we dismiss, threaten, describe the work of journalists in these, really harsh terms, is it also endangers journalists. We've seen political events where leaders turn and point out the journalists in the audience so everyone can yell at them and boo them when they're just there trying to report on what's happening. I worry very much about that because we benefit when we have reporters out there from public media, from commercial media, from across the political spectrum, able to do their jobs, ask the tough questions, report on what's going on. That's what we want them doing, reporting. Any effort to interfere or try to guess at their political affiliation or assume that people of different political affiliation can't ask hard questions, I think that does a great disservice.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize the chair of the Energy Subcommittee, Mr. Duncan, for his 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I used to drive 65,000 miles a year in my truck. And like Mr. Graham, I used to listen to NPR a good bit. In fact, I enjoyed All Things Considered. But unfortunately, all things aren't considered now. The ranking member of the subcommittee used the words objective reporting, but there's nothing objective about NPR now. If it was truly objective, we wouldn't even be here today. But we do have a responsibility to conduct oversight on how U.S. tax dollars are spent by government agencies, regardless what the agency is. And I really do wish that NPR's new left-wing CEO would have had the fortitude to show up today, but no such luck, I guess. If Ms. Maher were here, I could ask about why NPR reported Monday that TikTok isn't really the threat that this committee knows that it is, which is why we recently passed the divestment bill. Forbes got that story right, since it was their own journalist that discovered TikTok was spying on them, while NPR's reporting says there's no evidence of TikTok's espionage activities. Forbes journalists didn't need federal subsidies to get their reporting right. What NPR has evolved into, as evidenced by Mr. Graham's written testimony, is a Democrat propaganda machine funded by U.S. tax dollars. And that's wrong. If Ms. Maher were here, I could ask about why NPR never fired the NPR commentator who in 1995 described the potential rapture disappearance of millions of Christians as, quote, leaving the world a better place. If Ms. Maher were here, I could ask her why her network chose to promote abortions in America by broadcasting one in 2022. If Ms. Maher were here, I could ask why we need taxpayer-funded media outlet at all, since there is a plethora of available sources that can provide journalism without government subsidies. I could ask her why great radio stations like WRD in South Carolina need government-subsidized competition. But Ms. Maher decided to duck this hearing. So instead, I'll simply discuss H.R. 1632, Ronnie Jackson's bill to end government funding of NPR and the parent corporation for public broadcasting, of which I'm a proud co-sponsor. Or H.R. 8083 from the next senator of Indiana, Jim Banks, and congratulations, Jim, for his great win last night, another bill to prohibit funding for NPR. And I'm a proud co-sponsor of that one too. Or H.R. 8091 to prevent government funding for NPR or any other radio content from my friend, Chair of the House Freedom Caucus, Bob Good of Virginia. I'm a co-sponsor of that one too. We shouldn't be funding a propaganda machine, which is what NPR has evolved into. The Constitution lays out 17 enumerated powers for this government, providing state media in one of them. NPR and PBS have become American Pravda, a reliable mouthpiece for the liberal bureaucracy and their left-wing enablers. It's time to restore some sanity to this government by eliminating NPR's federal boondoggle. If the public wishes to support so-called public broadcasting, they can still choose to send their own hard-earned money rather than have us tax them to do it. I hope this committee will look at ending NPR and CPB, and that our friends on the Appropriations Committee will stop cutting them checks. Just a couple examples. They didn't want to report on the Hunter Biden laptop story. In fact, they tried to poo-poo that and say it was Russian propaganda, and we now know that was all reported by this propaganda machine to influence an election. NPR should not be there to influence elections in this country. NPR should be there to inform the general public on the threats to Americans' liberty and freedom, true reporting on storms that are going on, emergency broadcast, information that the public needs, not that NPR wants them to hear or see. That's not the role. And so, Mr. Chairman, thanks for holding this valuable hearing. And I look forward to the work this Congress should be doing on this important issue. With that, I yield back.
Now, thank you, the gentleman, for yielding back. Now recognize Mr. Tonko of New York. All right, now recognize Mr. Ruiz of California for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I proudly represent California's 25th Congressional District, a district informed by many local media outlets and journalists. Local broadcasters positively contribute to the lives of millions of Americans every day, providing objective information that allows the public to hold its government accountable. Most Americans agree that local news organizations get it right. They report the news accurately, cover the most important stories, are transparent, and keep an eye on local political leaders. According to a Pew Research report released yesterday, 85% of Americans affirmed the significance of local news outlets in fostering the welfare of their community. For many, a public broadcast serves as their initial source of weather forecasts, traffic updates, local election updates, and community event notifications each morning. And therefore, safeguarding the accessibility and caliber of local news remains paramount. Mr. Hustock, in your testimony, you speak of the importance of local journalism. In your perspective, what effect does local journalism have on public engagement and trust with the media?
There's been significant research by the Medill School at Northwestern on public participation in local institutions as a result of having regular, routine coverage of city council meetings, school boards. That's the kind of coverage we need on public radio. My concern is that's getting crowded out by the need of local stations to send their money to Washington. And so a more balanced approach to the funding stream would allow those local stations to be the reporter at the school board, to be the reporter at the city council, at the zoning board, at the water and sewer commission.
Thank you. The Pew report also found that 63% of Americans express confidence in the financial stability of their local news outlets, yet recent revelations suggest otherwise. Mr. Aaron, can you describe the challenges local news organizations face, especially regarding their finances?
Yes, thank you, Congressman. I think that result you cite is very concerning because it shows that most Americans don't really know what a precarious state the finances of local news is in, including public broadcasting. Most Americans assume we actually spend far more than we actually do on the public broadcasting system, and they're happy with it. They say that that's a good use of taxpayer money. In fact, I think there was a survey that said it was second only to the national defense in terms of things taxpayers thought that was a good use of federal funds. But of course, it's a pittance compared to what's needed. And with the decline of commercial media, the real struggle, local commercial media, many of the national guys are doing okay, but when it comes to your local newspaper, your local radio station, people really committed to the community, there is a deep, deep financial struggle, and one that suggests we have to look for new solutions because we need those local reporters on the ground doing their jobs, and that's going to require of federal policy changes and Congress's attention to make sure that the local communities can actually get the news they need to be active participants in this democracy.
Financial hardships make local news organizations vulnerable to bad actors and big media conglomerates. A study by political scientists at Emory University in 2019 revealed that the acquisition of local stations and the advancement of partisan agendas exacerbates the deterioration of local journalism and fosters the spread of biased national news coverage. Mr. Aaron, how does the consolidation of local stations by large conglomerates affect those who depend on public broadcasting, whether through radio, television, or broadband, for their news?
I think the problem of runaway consolidation, first of all, has decimated newsrooms. It's cost a lot of jobs. As corporate consolidation happens and things become concentrated, they've gotten rid of a lot of reporters, whether that's newspapers or broadcasters. Furthermore, because the Federal Communications Commission has given up its responsibility to ensure greater diversity of ownership in local broadcasting, we've allowed a few dominant companies like Fox, like Sinclair, like Nexstar, to own hundreds of stations across the country, and most importantly, multiple stations within the same market. So instead of having a conservative station and another station and another station, you have one set of stations all owned by the same company, the same bosses.
I know my colleagues don't raise concern when Sinclair is buying up all the local stations and their conservative organization. The threat to local news is not remedied by an arbitrary political purity test like my colleagues across the aisle implied in their letter to NPR CEO Katherine Maher. We cannot allow the trust in our local broadcasters to be eroded by bad faith investigations or the predatory actions of big corporations. Let us instead support community journalism and rebuild the public's faith in the news. I thank our local broadcasters, including those in my district, for the hard and important work they do to educate and inform our constituents. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize Ms. Lesko for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you all for being here to testify today. I appreciate all your work. You know, I'm a supporter of local news. I think it's valuable, and I think we need it. I think there's a hunger in our society for just plain, unbiased news. You know, I talk to people all the time, and they're like, I've turned off the TV. I don't even watch that anymore. It just irritates me, you know? And people are just fed up. Their blood pressure is too high. And I even look around, I'm like, what is the truth? What is the truth? It's just all opinions. And so I want that. But if my taxpayer dollars and my constituents' taxpayer dollars are paying for NPR, then it should be unbiased. That's the point. And when my Democratic colleagues are passionate and say, well, Fox News is biased, well, guess what? CNN and MSN is biased too, but the point is they're not publicly funded. That's the reason we're here. We're here because we're talking about taxpayer dollars, and when my Democratic colleagues say this is a waste of time, we shouldn't be talking about this, yes, we should. We're funding this. Yeah, it's only $5 million direct funds to NPR, but as was pointed out, all of the member stations have to pay in, and guess where those member stations get the money from? Well, they get it from taxpayer dollars through the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, right? And so don't tell me it's just $5 million. It's a heck of a lot more taxpayer dollars than that. And so my first question is for Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, what accountability measures should be implemented to ensure NPR provides impartial coverage and serves a broader audience?
Yeah, I mean, I think this has been the whole problem, as the chairman was saying, that the legislature doesn't want to sit there and listen to it. I think that a more regular hearing process would be important. It would be good for Katherine Maher to actually have to come up here and say, please explain to us why you decided the Hunter Biden laptop wasn't a story. You know, the executive that decided this, that it was a pure distraction, is now the editor of USA Today. He got promoted for that kind of news judgment. I'm not sure, other than some oversight hearings, I'm sure we don't want to have members of Congress do what we do and sit here and count minutes and seconds. But anybody who tries to do that is going to see, for example, yes, they're not covering Republican hearings. NPR doesn't want to cover Republican hearings, but they're going to give 45 hours to the January 6th committee where the Republicans weren't even allowed to select their own members. It's not hard to figure out. Is NPR biased? Listen to it for an hour. It's not difficult to figure out. It's not rocket science. Just this morning, they were talking about the white bonus, that white people benefit from systemic racism, and we're all have white privilege. There's a lot of white people in America who are like, I don't really like this story, and guess what? I don't get to speak. A lot of these things, there's nobody in there to say, well, now for somebody who doesn't believe there's a defense of looting, now you get 2 minutes.
Yeah.
That's a problem. I think oversight hearings may be just the thing to do, but you can see from the CEO not showing up, she's not ready to handle this. She doesn't take it seriously, I know she just started, but she was hired because of all these crazy tweets, right?
Yeah.
They didn't disqualify her. They basically qualified her when she said, well, I see why people would riot and loot.
Well, thank you for your comments. And you can see from the hemorrhaging of people that are in the middle or conservative listening to NPR that it's gotten so left-leaning and so biased that the people have given up listening to them. And that's sad. It's a sad state of affairs. And I want to help try to correct it because I do want local news. I just want the news, okay? I don't want to hear somebody's opinion. And so, Mr. Irwin, you're with the Taxpayer Union, is that?
Americans for Tax Reform.
Thank you, I'm sorry. How can taxpayer funding be used as a leverage point to encourage NPR to diversify its political viewpoints? I mean, that's kind of the gist of this hearing, isn't it?
Sure. I know we're over time, but quickly, there's been a lot of talk about the intimidation of journalists and that this hearing is the intimidation of NPR journalists. There's some truth to that. You know why? Because it's federally funded, and this committee has leverage over the news coverage that NPR is going to be capable of producing. That is wrong in a free society. In a democracy, you do not have state media. That is a dystopian, totalitarian, Iron Curtain style system. But what can be done to reform? I think that these other two witnesses have mentioned some great suggestions. The decentralization is going to be a great one. The focus on local news, regular hearings, more regular oversight. The last time in 1999 when this committee did have a hearing with NPR, by the way, it was over a scandal where local affiliates were sharing donor lists with Democratic Party operatives. So, I think that to call it a propaganda arm for the Democratic Party, it falls a little bit short. It's more of a money laundering operation for in-kind contributions to Democratic campaigns well beyond federal election regulation limits. But I think our suggestion is simply take away the money and make it a voluntary contribution that you can check on your tax form if you would like, and the disproportionately affluent people who do pay taxes will be able to make a contribution.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady for yielding back. Now recognize Ms. Seguet of Colorado for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I've been on this subcommittee for 28 years now. I've been the chair of this subcommittee, been the ranking member of this subcommittee. I consider the House Oversight and Investigations Subcommittee to be the preeminent investigatory committee in the House, which is why I am so deeply disappointed in this one-off partisan political hearing, which was thrown together at the last minute and put together. We could have a real investigation into issues about media independence, about what the role of the federal government is, but instead, we're having this hearing. I apologize I had to leave for a few minutes. The reason I had to leave for a few minutes is I went to a press conference just now at which there was one reporter from Colorado. And the one reporter from Colorado was from Colorado Public Radio, which happens to be the only media outlet from the state of Colorado that has a Washington bureau. She doesn't just cover me, she covers everybody else in my delegation, which includes our two senators, John Hickenlooper and Michael Bennett. It includes Lauren Boebert. It includes Doug Lamborn and all the Democrats. She covers all of us, and there's nobody else who does it. So I want to say shame on this committee for doing this. Apparently, in my absence, but also when I was here, this majority staff or the majority members keep attacking the NPR CEO, Katherine Maher, because she's not here. They gave her 1 week notice. She's a brand new CEO, and today is her board meeting, her first board meeting as CEO. And you want to haul her in here so that you can rake her over the coals for your partisan issues. Shame on this committee. I'm beside myself. I think it's outrageous. Also, in listening to the testimony of the first three of the witnesses on this committee, you would think that NPR is a urban-only liberal democratic organ. That is so far from the truth. The NPR has member stations all across the country. You heard the ranking member say in Florida, some of these stations in rural areas are the only ones who are giving weather reports about impending hurricanes and other extreme weather events. Same thing in Colorado. In Colorado, we have member affiliates in Colorado Springs, Colorado. Hate to tell anybody who's ever looked at Colorado Springs, not a liberal bastion. We have a member affiliate in Greeley, Colorado. Hate to tell you, not a liberal bastion. And all of these affiliates are reporting on news that one won't hear anyplace else. I also want to say something else, which is less than 1% of NPR's budget comes directly from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting grants. In fact, in 2022, NPR received just over $5.5 million in these grants from CPB. So, Mr. Aaron, I want to ask you, I know you don't work for NPR, but in your knowledge, is this fact true?
To the best of my knowledge, Congresswoman, it is true. I think that the important thing here is that that those are the direct subsidies that go to NPR. And of course, stations also want NPR programming because their listeners want it. So the reason they're paying for that programming is they want to hear, of course, the local coverage where we really need to be investing, but also international coverage, also national coverage, also the marquee interview programs. These are what keep listeners tuning into these stations. This is why this service is so popular.
And that's
So
why
not
it's
an
the public broadcasting system, right?
Correct.
Because they'll cover issues like that may not be economically advantageous for a commercial station to cover, correct?
I mean, that is the mission of the system, is to do the stories that are going uncovered elsewhere. So when the commercial media is all over a story, it is not necessarily NPR's job to just echo that, to just tell people the same story they're hearing from their favorite cable channel or their favorite local broadcaster. It is to do other original reporting, break their own stories.
Excuse me. So Mr. Graham had many examples of what he saw were failures by NPR to cover, but all the things he mentioned were widely covered in all of the rest of the press, from Fox News to MSNBC and everything else in between. Is that right?
As far as I know, I mean, we're talking about 30 or 40 years of coverage where I can't imagine the number of stories that would have happened. And of course, you know, it doesn't mean NPR, people can't criticize the stories. I hear stories all the time. Oh, I wish they'd done this. I wish they'd quoted this person. But it's the aggregate. It's the coming back. It's the staying on the beats. That's what matters, especially at that local level. And especially, as you pointed out, when there are no longer other journalists, for example, here covering what happens in Congress because of that corporate consolidation that Mr. Ruiz was raising up, where the newspapers just simply closed their bureaus here in D.C., where commercial broadcast television isn't covering an individual delegation. Those are the places we need public media to step up, and where fortunately in places like Colorado, it is doing so.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back and now recognize the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Palmer, for his 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to respond to my Democratic colleagues' concerns about local media and the role that NPR plays in that. There was an article that pointed out that traditional outlets like the New York Times have moved so far to the left that they and other national outlets have lost the trust of most Americans, who now place more trust in state and local media. In response to that, left-wing foundations have made massive investments in nonprofit journalism and related efforts, most notably the John D. and Katherine T. MacArthur Foundation put up $500 million over 5 years in hopes of fundamentally upending the local news marketplace and buying a place in the local news. Now, Mr. Graham, Mr. Irwin, you can respond to this. I think it's pretty evident that content is driven by your revenue sources. Would you agree with that, yes or no?
Yeah, there has been this tendency now in public media, obviously. They'll tell you that they're provided, they're supported by the MacArthur Foundation or something. But private journalism too.
Well, and Mr. Irwin, if you'd like to respond, it's a yes or no, really.
Yes, and that includes tax dollars.
Well, the point that I want to make is that you agree that revenue drives content. Okay, if you're not providing the content, then the money's not going to be there. And we've kind of gotten wrapped around the axle a little bit about taxpayer funding of this, which I think is wrong. Frankly, I think we shouldn't be funding left-wing propaganda. But I do think we need to look at the content and the source of revenue. And if you start looking at, for instance, who funds these organizations, they're the same people who make political contributions to left-wing Democratic candidates. They're also, this is what's really interesting to me, some of these foundations are the same people who are funding the pro-Palestinian demonstrations. I mean, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, for instance, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. David Rockefeller has been very open about his support of some of these demonstrations and is a major supporter of Democratic candidates. Mike and Nick Pritzker, the Hyatt Hotel family, same thing. You look at Arabella, which is a conglomerate of funding sources of left-wing foundations. William and Flora Hewlett, David and Lucille Packard, the Ford Foundation, Robert Wood Johnson, Gordon Betty Moore Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation. Isn't it interesting that these are the same people who fund NPR? Would you think it would have an impact on content, Mr. Graham?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the socialist critique of the news media used to be that, if Ford's funding the news media, then it must all be pro-big business. Well, a lot of times today in public broadcasting, when you just listen to them saying, the show is brought to you by the Public Welfare Foundation for Transformative Justice. I mean, they do announce, basically, we are giving money to get a certain result. Back under the Obama years, NPR actually took money from a charity called the Plowshares Fund, explicitly to report on the Iran arms, the Iranian arms thing.
But
they were supporters of giving Iran
These are
arms.
the same foundations that are funding the radical climate agenda that has caused food prices to skyrocket, household energy costs to skyrocket. They're the same people who advocate open borders. They're the same radical left funding anarchist groups. They're the same individuals behind the foundations who fund Democratic candidates who then advocate for more left-wing radical policies that have created the border crisis, made food unaffordable, and have made our communities less safe. And so my point, gentlemen and my colleagues, is that what we're really talking about here is a major network funding a propaganda machine that supports left-wing policies, that completely ignores conservative points of view, that the same people who are funding this propaganda machine is also funding liberal Democratic candidates, and they're the same people funding these protesters and these anarchist groups. Gentlemen, you're welcome to respond. Mr. Graham, Mr. Irwin?
I would just add that Katherine Maher comes from this world. She was previously the head of the Wikimedia Foundation. She is on the board of Signal, and she's explicitly said the First Amendment is a problem. I know her tweets have become somewhat famous, but she's one of their operatives, and absolutely, taking over NPR is part of their desire to drive what everyone's able to think and what narratives are allowed in our society.
I just think you have to look at the 990s and you know, look at who's funding this to really understand what's going on here. Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to have this. I think this hearing was justified, and we should have had it a long time ago. And I agree with my Democrat colleagues. I'd be happy to have another hearing and bring the CEO of NPR in here to answer some of these questions.
And I
Go
hope
back.
we will at a time that's more convenient. The gentleman yields back now. Recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Before I get into my comments and questions, let me just acknowledge that I understand that that Ms. Maher has submitted, the CEO of NPR has submitted formal testimony to the subcommittee, and that she is working actively to determine a date by which to appear for the subcommittee. So just want to state that for the record. NPR is a trusted daily news source for millions of Americans, and its affiliate stations are pillars of their local communities, particularly in rural areas like many of those in New York's 20th Congressional District. For many small markets, the local NPR affiliate station might be the last remaining local news source and only reliable source of information during extreme weather or other emergencies. Unfortunately, my Republican colleagues seem to disagree, which is why they're wasting time with the hearing attacking NPR. While the majority pretends to care about public media and say they simply want to protect it from bias, they ignore the very real threat to independent public journalism posed by some of their most ardent supporters. Project 2025 is a framework drafted by conservative activists meant to serve as a policy roadmap for a future Republican administration. Alongside schemes to use federal agencies to settle political vendettas are plans to punish public broadcasters for unfavorable reporting, harkening back decades to similar efforts by President Nixon to purge public broadcasters of critical commentary and make them beholden to White House policy directives. I have provided staff with a document for inclusion in the record of a New York Times article detailing the Nixon administration's concerted effort to control public broadcasters for political gain, and ask that that this article be submitted into the record.
We will take a look at it and take that up at the end of the hearing.
Republicans' lack of real evidence to back up their claims pointed to NPR listeners' reported political leanings in surveys and changes in overall listenership, underscores the weak and brazenly partisan nature of their complaints. Republican presidents and members of Congress have spent decades telling voters not to trust mainstream media outlets like NPR and have been trying to undermine public broadcasting ever since the Public Broadcasting Act became law more than 50 years ago. If the news doesn't support their worldview, they call it biased. So, Mr. Aaron, I have a question for you. What has happened to democracies in other countries when a political party tries to discredit media organizations with which they disagree?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Tonko. I think it's very dangerous. Obviously, attacking the media is one of the first things that precedes larger attacks on functioning democracies and, you know, the rise of authoritarianism. We know that has happened in other countries. We know that when we look at measures of healthy democracies, it's positively correlated with investment in public media systems. The democracies that are providing for their citizens, that have high citizen involvement in the governing process, things like that, relates to, do they fund public media system? And that is unfortunately a list where this country currently is an outlier among major leading democracies, all of which have recognized the importance of investing in public media in order to help keep citizens informed of what's happening where they live.
Well, setting up the media for failure and impacting their credibility comes in handy at a time when they disagree with you or report something that is quite aggressive to bring it to the public's attention, and then you can easily say as a victim that you warned everybody that the media was not to be trusted. So yeah, very concerning dynamics. Independent journalism is essential, I believe, to a functioning democracy. Relentlessly attacking public broadcasters until your supporters no longer trust their public radio station is wrong and not evidence of bias. It is only evidence of the lengths to which Republicans will go to put politics over people. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize the Chair of the Health Subcommittee of Energy and Commerce, Mr. Guthrie, for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. You know, the difference in some of the media outlets that people are discussing today and public radio is federal funding. So I mean, there's a distinct difference in those two. And I don't agree with stuff that comes off on some networks on television, but we're not here today talking about that because we don't federally fund them. That's people's decision. And it does make us an outlier. I'm glad the United States is an outlier because we have the First Amendment and so when you compare us to other countries in the world, I'm glad that we're free and we have free and open press. But the difference is local, is funding. And it ties into my question because I can't let it go talking about bluegrass. We all know bluegrass comes from Jerusalem Ridge in Ohio County, Kentucky with Bill Monroe. That's where it originated. And if we had vibrant local news that's broadcast throughout the nation, you can hear great stories on WKYU public radio from Jerusalem Ridge and Bill Monroe, Blue Moon of Kentucky. And so my question, I guess, is Mr. Husak, because when I look at this, I have WKYU is Western Kentucky affiliated public radio, and their television station as well. And I know the journalists on there, they work hard. I don't always agree with the way they cover me, but I absolutely think they do it in a fair way. Sometimes the stories they do that are fair, and I think that's the judge. If they're always biased against you, that's one thing. If they cover you in a positive way sometimes, in a negative way, and sometimes that's just fair. And so I view it that way. And they're hardworking. And so the big question, it just seems, so we cherry pick evidence. I've listened to All Things Considered several times, and I'll listen to it, and I can see how some of my friends on the other side think they're being fair. But I can tell you just the way that I know the inside of how a bill passed or a bill's moving or legislation or an issue, and I know they're not presenting the information in a way that's even unbiased, not even favorable. They slant it in a way that they want their audience to hear it. And I could see why people, their demographic of who listens to them, because that's what they want to hear. So, Mr. Husak, how does what's going on at the national level affect these local affiliates who have good journalists that work hard? And how are they being, the bias at the national level seems to be affecting people at the local level?
Thank you for that question. I don't want to get involved in the bluegrass discussion between Kentucky and Southwest.
You need to turn your mic on. Sorry.
I'm going to avoid the bluegrass discussion between Kentucky and Southwest Virginia.
Well, there's not a discussion. It's fact. But they have good music. If you give Bill Monroe credit, it's fact. But you can't argue with the Stanleys either.
What's been happening at the local level at NPR stations is very interesting. More and more of them are understanding that the market failure that motivated President Johnson to start the public broadcasting system in the first place is affecting their localities. And more of them are specializing in local news. WNYC in New York is one of the largest news providers in New York City. And it's all over the country, Chicago, Boston. But these stations are also having to lay off because their revenues are down because they have to send so much of their money to Washington. So the effect is to make it more difficult for them to provide what the market is failing to provide. What the economists call market failure. When does government get involved? When there's a market failure. We are seeing a market failure in local journalism, and that can be a better role for local public radio, but not if they can't keep the money that we're sending to the CPB.
So, I guess you kind of answered my next question. So how would it improve the current audience? What do you think would happen to the current audience if we decentralized it?
What would happen to?
The current audience. What would change in the current audience? Currently, you say it's higher income progressives that listen to public radio. How would you perceive the market or the audience changing for public radio if we followed your system of the decentralization?
Yeah, a very important point to keep in mind about local public radio stations. They're only getting about 8% of their funding from the CPB. They have to send a large portion of that to Washington, a significant portion. But they rely on their local listeners. They face a sort of a market test. They have to make sure that they're not alienating their local listeners. And so they'll be providing something that people want in order to keep their doors open. And that way they'll be producing programming that, in my hope, will be shared with the National Public Radio Network, NPR, and will reflect a wider, it's not so much a diversity of philosophies and ideologies. I hope that's kept out of the news altogether, frankly, but it would be windows into what's going on across America in a variety of ways. And that way we would hear different voices, and I think it would provide a better rationale for National Public Radio.
Thank you. My time's expired now. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Peters, for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for the hearing. I have been in and out, but in the conversation today, we've heard a lot about NPR and its national reporting and programming, and I urge NPR to consider making a renewed effort in that. I'll talk a little bit more later in nonpartisan journalism. But there's a crucial mission of local reporting executed by NPR member stations across the country. 5 NPR affiliate stations serve listeners in my district. I want to thank the hardworking journalists at the stations in my district and the stations across the country for bringing the news directly to the people. These local reporters and stations are critical in meeting residents where they are with local news tailored to community interests. And I think other people have mentioned, Ms. Castor in particular, the difficulty with local newspapers. According to AP, the decline of local news in the U.S. is speeding up to the point where our country has lost 1/3 of its newspapers and 2/3 of its newspaper journalists since 2005. I'm seeing this trend reflected at home in San Diego. In 2018, the same an investment firm bought both the LA Times and the San Diego Union Tribune, but by 2023, sold off the Union Tribune and to a company whose orientation was to make huge cuts. I think they're still doing great work there, but they're just not resourced for it. And I think that's one of the reasons why I support the investment of the federal government in local news through PBS. And I think, Mr. Husak, I've heard the local stations complain about having to pony up to the national too, so I understand what you're saying. But let me just say, one of the problems I have with the presidency of Mr. Trump was his attack on some of the institutions that government doesn't regulate. We don't own education. We don't do science. But he attacked that sort of the truth of science, the justice system. He attacked the integrity of the justice system and journalism, fake news. And I don't necessarily think that journalism has really done a good job of responding to it. And I want to ask you, Mr. Aaron, we tend to get into these very binary discussions here. But I want NPR and I want those stations to take these criticisms really seriously. Because what we need as elected officials, we need a conversation that we don't often have in Congress, which is what are the nuances? What are the pluses and minuses on this issue? And you don't always get that. I think you get that less and less from journalism in general. We see more celebrity journalists. I mean, in my own community, I've got journalists who tweet about issues as if they're activists. And I look and say, isn't that the reporter supposed to be telling me about this? If I were a news agency, I think I'd want to, for my own credibility, I want to take a hard look at that and maybe even cut back on that. The thing is, what we need here out of journalism is we need people to tell us what to think about, not what to think. And this is from a lot of news outlets, I see a real point of view, and I see that on the right and the left. Some of them don't apologize for it. I mean, Fox News and Newsmax, they know what they're about. Others do it without admitting it. But with respect to NPR, you've got serious criticisms out there about objectivity that I think need to be met. I think what we talk about diversity ought to be diversity of opinion, ought to be a diversity of political opinion. I think that's a legitimate question. I don't think NPR is going to be defunded. I think there's a lot of folks on both sides of the aisle who really do trust it and rely on it at a local level. But we don't have any input from the federal government side to any other news organizations, right? This is the only one we provide funding to. And I'm asking for some leadership in the field of journalism in general to bring about some credibility and really think hard about the perceptions that people have that you're on one side or the other. And again, I'm not as concerned about people who overtly make that their business as I am about NPR and the local stations. So we could talk more specifically about it, but I just wanted to say that these criticisms are they're real in the sense that a lot of people carry them, and people, not everyone in this room has that viewpoint, but people do have that viewpoint about some of the journalism in these stations, and I just hope that NPR will take the opportunity to look at it seriously. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize Mr. Joyce for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Chairman Guffey and Ranking Member Castor, for holding this hearing today and allowing me to weigh in. Thank you to all of our witnesses for testifying. Truly, all things being considered, it is disappointing that no one from NPR, particularly that Katherine Maher, is not present with us here today to defend the funding that they receive from the federal government in face of the claims of a political bias. One would think that my constituents in South Central and Southwestern Pennsylvania would be a target audience for NPR. Rural listeners who rely on radio for news, for emergency alerts, and more should be who are listening. They are not. However, this audience is exactly not listening because NPR is alienating them. NPR is failing at their core tenets by perpetrating leftist bias in their news and in their reporting. And as uncovered by Yuri Berliner, this is all in spite of being funded by American taxpayer dollars. This is a cultural bias, it is a political bias, and certainly at times it's a moral bias. What we're seeing from NPR is that they're pushing liberal viewpoints, and in fact, just this morning, they were on the radio podcast Up First, defending TikTok and the Chinese Communist Party, comparing our actions to stop the spread of the Chinese Communist Party spyware to China's Great Firewall, which is used to censor speech and intimidate political opponents, calling it, I'm quoting, an eye for an eye. NPR was intended to bring Americans the news, not to cater to one particular political party. NPR has a mission statement, and they need to return to that mission statement, which says it will serve the individual and regard the individual differences among men with respect and joy rather than derision and hate. Mr. Graham, how far do you believe that NPR has strayed from that original mission to deliver unbiased reporting and news?
A long way. I think that this is, as the gentleman from California was suggesting, it's not hard to attempt a balanced story. Obviously, somebody could come to this hearing and quote the Democrat point of view and a Republican point of view. And this is exactly what we see so many times, is that they're only going to choose the point of view that they want. And they'll say, well, we included a Republican point of view. It was Liz Cheney saying the president's a horrible person. I mean, that's fake balance. But I mean, I think that there is it can be done. Balanced journalism can be done. Factual journalism without a lot of opinion can be done.
Are you aware of any internal checks and balances, that balance that you talk about, that NPR has in place to ensure that there is fair reporting?
I don't think there's any evidence of internal. They talk about how they have robust conversations about journalism inside. Obviously, Mr. Berliner was trying to provide that robust conversation. The point that he was making in his article was nobody was really changing anything. They would listen to him politely. Nothing changes. I can certainly say from listening to it, they're not attempting fairness and balance. They're not even close. We would acknowledge it if there was some attempt.
Mr. Irwin, do you feel that NPR reporters are objective, or are they actually an array of activists who are on the air?
They're definitely closer to an array of activists on the air. I don't want to paint all of them with the same brush because there are certainly people there who work really hard, and many of them are sincere and really think they're presenting objective information, but they come from a skewed perspective. I mean, they come from the type of people who listen to NPR. It's affluent progressives who tend to be in major urban centers. And I want to quickly note that there's been some conflating of the national and local affiliates in this hearing today. There's been a lot of talk about local news and the dependence of rural areas, like you mentioned as well. But as you've made clear, what we're talking about is the national public radio, not local public radio. And the people who staff that do not represent rural areas. They do not represent Mrs. DeJett's district, for example. So in short, yes.
Mr. Irwin, what specific steps should we in Congress take to make sure that NPR is more accountable to the taxpayer?
I think that our policy suggestion of making it a voluntary contribution you can make in your tax form, like for the Federal Elections Fund, will allow people who like NPR to contribute, and people who don't like NPR won't be forced to. And then NPR can take that, and like every other media outlet, they can cater to the audience that wants to support them, which will probably mean they'll continue to cater to they already cater to, but they won't receive taxpayer money for it. The alternative is something I wouldn't want to suggest, which is that Congress has to actively police the balance. And editorial independence is rightfully prized by NPR. If they're going to enjoy it, they shouldn't be funded by taxpayers.
I agree that editorial independence is a part of our Constitution, but when it is being funded to a biased organization like NPR, American taxpayers must stop paying for it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, again for allowing me to wave on. My time has expired. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. We have what appear to be one more member who would like to ask questions. Do you need a minute to get your info?
Okay, we'll figure it out.
We'll give you a second or two. We appreciate the witnesses being here today, and I believe this is our last member to ask questions, and then we'll close out. We do appreciate you all being here, and give him just another second. This is what happens when we have multiple committees and multiple subcommittees going at the same time. Sometimes people are racing from one to another, and he knew he only had about 20 or 30 seconds to get here, and he raced through the door just in the nick of time. All right, that being said, I now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Crenshaw, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for letting me catch my breath a little bit. Thank you all for being here. I'm disappointed that the new CEO is not here. It shows a severe lack of courage not showing up to this committee and answering some simple questions about political bias for what is an extremely important organization, a taxpayer-funded organization that prides itself supposedly on unbiased news reporting, but that's just not what we've seen from NPR in recent years, and I'm happy to let our witnesses comment on that here in a second, but it's been observed pretty accurately that NPR has been used as a tool to protect Hunter Biden, refusing to publish stories about Mr. Biden and his laptop. NPR's managing editor even claimed that it wasn't a real story, but simply a distraction. If that wasn't enough, they pushed pro-Chinese Communist Party propaganda onto their listeners, going so far as to celebrate the 70th anniversary of the communist takeover of China, sending one of their own reporters to Beijing to praise the CCP, I guess to get in their good favor. I don't know what their excuse would be for that. And all while taking taxpayer dollars. And so there's obviously a need for improvement in the culture and acknowledgement that there is bias in this newsroom, and yet the new CEO was just hired, has dreams of sampling baklava with Kamala Harris and called former President Trump a deranged racist sociopath. So that's not unbiased. Katherine Maher informed us she would not be testifying today. I guess you'd want to answer these questions. So, Mr. Graham, if I may start with you, you've collected a pretty impressive assortment of NPR's failures and failures to have unbiased reporting. Give us your thoughts on that, and is Ms. Maher a good fit to change course?
Oh, I don't think there's any intention to change course. I think that's why she was selected. It would be interesting to hear her try to explain what it is that they're trying to do. Because when we listen to this radio network on a regular basis, it's quite clear. You can understand why the Democrats don't want to have a hearing about this. It works very, very well for them, right? You can understand why the gentleman from Free Press has to say he's not here to represent public broadcasting, but they are very closely affiliated and fight for the funding together. Obviously Democrats like the system exactly as it is right now.
Yeah.
And so the very least we can do is, yes, have the CEO in and try to explain who in there is doing anything to suggest maybe we should have a more balanced set of interviews.
Yeah.
Right? Let's have a more balanced set of journalists. You won't see anybody from Fox News on NPR.
No. And you would think that's what the whole point. If you're going to do unbiased media, then it has to be unbiased. Biased media is okay. Just admit it, though. MSNBC does not try to claim that it's unbiased. I don't even think Fox tries to claim it's unbiased anymore. It's just not, right? We've had biased media in this country since our founding. But if you're going to be a taxpayer-funded media company, you actually have to adhere to the principles of unbiased news broadcasting, or say the quiet part out loud. And maybe that's the benefit of the new CEO. She has said the quiet part out loud pretty clearly, and so there can be no question about what direction NPR is headed, and it can be simply written off. And maybe we should look at ways to defund it. How would we, in Congress, perhaps some suggestions on how we would change course in NPR? Anybody want to take that via funding mechanisms?
Yeah, so our suggestion is that a box be added to the tax return for individuals to check, like for the federal elections fund, that makes it a voluntary contribution. That would still be a huge favor to NPR because you'd be giving them free fundraising appeals, but you would not be forcing working and middle-class taxpayers to fund programming that caters to affluent elite types. And I just also wanted to mention, Congressman, that my sister and her family moved to your district last year, and I think they're watching us today, so.
Very lucky, very lucky. It's great. Hope they didn't flood. We had a lot of rain this weekend we're working on. So anyway, appreciate y'all being here. I look forward to hopefully engaging with the new CEO of NPR. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, for bringing this topic to light. It's an important one. People have to know what's real and what isn't, what's opinion and what is news. And again, it's okay to have opinion. And I think the main downfall of our national discussions in the last 20, 30 years have been the inability to distinguish between what is editorializing, what is opinion newsmaking, and what is actual unbiased news. Making actual unbiased news is hard. It was supposed to be why we had something like NPR, was to create that. And because there's not really a market for it, so it makes sense that it would have to be taxpayer funded, but then it actually has to be that, unbiased. I appreciate you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Seeing that now there are no further members wishing to ask questions, I would like to thank our witnesses again for being here today and taking your time to share your thoughts with us. I ask unanimous consent to insert in the record the documents included on the staff hearing documents list. That does include the document that Mr. Tonko earlier presented. Without objection, that will be the order. Pursuant to committee rules, I remind members they have 10 business days to submit additional questions for the record, and I ask the witnesses to submit their responses within 10 business days upon receipt of those questions. And without objection, the committee is adjourned.
Thank you.
Good job. Great to meet you.
Thank you.